March 22, 1945. Less than a month before the Battle for Berlin begins, the last news broadcast of the Third Reich was broadcast in Germany. Although during the first years of the war everything was good news, and great successes were always announced, now, with just a few days to go, the news was very different. So, with the Western Allies advancing into Germany after having crossed the Remagen Bridge, and with the Soviets on the bank of the Oder just 70 kilometers from the capital of the Reich, what news stood out in this latest report? Did they continue talking about victory, or did they show that the end had arrived? Well, that is exactly what we are going to see next. The first scene with which newscast number 755 began was with a short report to the head of the Air Force Bomb Disposal Unit in Berlin. This was a truly worrying issue, affecting practically all medium or large-sized German cities. Previously in another program, we saw what the brutal bombing that Berlin suffered on February 3rd was like, in which 1,500 bombers and 1,000 escort fighters participated. Unfortunately for the civilians, the punishment received was not only the hours that the bombing lasted, but it continued days later with the explosions of all the bombs that had been scattered throughout the city without exploding. In this way, a team of specialists had to be created to deactivate each of these bombs, so that they would not continue causing more casualties to civilians. The issue of the bombings that Germany was suffering was one of the most important issues of all, and this is what Goebbels wrote in his diary. This concern was because the bombings had a great impact on the morale of the population, and this effect had to be mitigated as much as possible. In this way, and given the impossibility of stopping these air raids, the only thing they could announce in this news program as positive news was the good work that was being done in deactivating the bombs that had not exploded when they fell to the ground. The next section in this last newscast was that of several civilians firing the revolutionary Panzerfaust. This fragment talks about the characteristics of this anti-tank weapon, and highlights how easy it is to use. Verbatim, it is said to be as easy to use as it looks, with special emphasis placed on the fact that women can use it too. As you know, although the Germans always tried to keep women away from combat, during these last months a call was made for them to actively participate in the defense of many German cities, which had to resist until the end. To tell the truth, of all the miraculous weapons that war propaganda announced, the Panzerfaust was shown to be the most simple and effective, having extra value in the desperate urban combats that were taking place in 1945. After commenting on this aspect of the Panzerfaust, the newsreel continues with the famous scene of Hitler, in which he decorates some boys from the Hitler Youth in the courtyard of the Chancellery, a few meters from his bunker in Berlin. This famous scene has often been confused with the act that Hitler carried out on April 20th, in which he also decorated some boys from the Hitler Youth for their actions in the defense of the capital. However, and as shown in this newsreel, the presentation of decorations represented in this newsreel of March 22nd was taken a few weeks before the screening of this program. Thus, this was the last recording of Hitler that was broadcast in Germany. Like this scene, the vast majority of images that have remained from the Second World War belong to these German newsreels that were distributed throughout the country, and were also sent to the Allied countries. In any case, and closing this section, after the presentation of decorations by the German leader, several of these young people proudly commented on their recent actions against the Red Army, and acted as an example for the rest of the German boys for what was to come. While this fragment of the newsreel is directed at members of the Hitler Youth, the following is directed at members of the Volkssturm. As we saw in a recent program, this formation mainly included civilians over 50 years of age, who to date had not yet been mobilized for combat. In this way, it was expected that when the Allies reached German territory, these men would fight in their regions, in a desperate attempt to stop the enemy advance. Thus, what is shown in this latest newsreel in relation to this matter is the first man belonging to the Volkssturm who has been decorated with the Knight's Cross for his defensive actions in the Prussian city of Königsberg. Immediately afterwards, the heroic resistance that is taking place in the city of Wrocław stands out, which had been surrounded in Silesia after the advance of Ivan Konev's armies. This was without a doubt one of the fortress cities that resisted the most, and that carried out the orders of the German leader until the end, producing his surrender a few days after the fall of Berlin. Next, the news program analyzes how fortification work is being carried out in many cities, highlighting that the entire population is participating in these tasks. Trenches, anti-tank ditches, machine gun posts and all types of barricades had to be ready before the enemy attacked the city. Finally, and before closing this section, German war propaganda shows images in which members of the Volkssturm have shot down several Soviet tanks, and shows the moment in which the soldiers who have carried out this action are decorated. The German news continues showing images of the evacuations of civilians that are taking place along the entire Baltic coast, where the Soviets have carried out several sieges. Thus, the Kriegsmarine, in addition to evacuating civilians, still has to take supplies to places like Courland, where two German armies were still resisting, which were isolated there at the end of 1944, and this is exactly what this section points out. Well, after having focused on the resistance that is being carried out in these cities and isolated positions, one of the last issues that the German news program of March 22 deals with is the great effort that the German people are still making in the war effort. This includes the work of workers in factories, who produce material to send to the front where this war material is more necessary than ever. Furthermore, while images of the trains carrying this material to the battlefield are projected on the newsreel, the brutality with which the Soviet soldiers act is explained to the viewer. Thus, and although until not long ago people had wanted to avoid talking about this type of misery and abuse that the civilian population had begun to experience, on this occasion what was to come was announced without any concealment. For this purpose, several German women who had seen firsthand what the Red Army soldiers had done were interviewed. These women commented that they could not speak of men or soldiers, since the correct word was wild beasts. These women also add that all these soldiers are drunk and that they act with great cruelty. In an attempt to add more drama, and to make everyone understand what was going to happen to them if they did not manage to stop the Soviet advance, while these women speak, terrible images of dead children and women are shown on the news. Furthermore, it is openly commented that every woman between 13 and 68 years old was being raped, thus sounding a total alarm for the entire German population. Finally, and before finishing, images of the fighting that is taking place in the vicinity of the Oder River are shown again, where the German soldiers have established the final defensive line. In this way, and after showing images of downed Soviet tanks, the awarding of decorations to the soldiers who have carried out these actions is once again highlighted. The final slogan with which the newscast of March 22 says goodbye is the following: "Soldiers, fight and resist." Although this was the last audio-visual broadcast with which an attempt was made to inform and motivate the Germans, so that they could prepare for the critical situation that was to come, there was another statement from Goebbels just a month later. On this occasion, and due to the difficulties of the moment, it could only be broadcast on the radio on April 21, when the Red Army had already begun its attack on the capital, and was only a few hours away from completely surrounding the city. This last harangue from the German propaganda minister said the following: "Berlin has become a frontline city. Defenders of Berlin, the eyes of your mothers, wives, and daughters are upon you. They have trusted you with their life, their health, their fortune, and their future. Now you know your task, and I know that you will fulfill it in an exemplary manner. Has arrived the time of truth." Once we have seen this, let's do a little analysis of this latest news program from the Third Reich. In total, this newscast was made up of 7 main news items, each of them having an objective. Firstly, an attempt is made to calm the population as much as possible, in relation to the brutal bombings that are taking place in German cities. Secondly, the advantages of a weapon like the Panzerfaust are highlighted, which can be handled by everyone, and it is made clear that it will be the weapon that will stop the Allies. Thirdly, the Führer takes center stage, and he tries to appear cheerful and confident, decorating some young soldiers who have stood out in the fulfillment of his duty. The fourth section is starring the soldiers of the Volkssturm and the resistance that is taking place in fortress cities that have been isolated in the rear of the Red Army. Next, fifthly, we are shown the great work that the German Navy is doing to rescue civilians along the entire Baltic coast, and its effort to send supplies to the troops that continue to resist in Courland and in Königsberg. Up to this point, And despite the desperate nature of the situation, the news is quite positive and attempts at all times to raise the morale of soldiers and civilians. However, in section number 6 everything changes, and for the first time, atrocious images are shown of what will happen to them if the last line of German resistance on the Oder collapses. Finally, and as a compilation, in 7th place images of the fierce fight in the Oder are shown again, and it ends with a speech of fight and resist. So, what did you think of this latest German newscast? Do you think it was effective in providing that final motivation for the German people to face what was to come? Would you like to analyze what Goebbels' last day was like, this man being the one who for so many years was in charge of these propaganda services? He left this program in the description.